again, and welcome to Incura's 2023 webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. As Latasha mentioned, I'm Lamar Oglesby, Executive Director of Research Financial Services, at Rutgers University, State University of New Jersey. In the context of this conversation, I am the chair of Incura's Select Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and today's moderator for our webinar on embracing neurodiversity in the workplace. Joining me for today's webinar is Dr. Hala Annabi, Associate Professor of Information Management and Director of Asscoiate Research Group Professor in the University of Washington's Information School. Her research and consulting focuses on creating and maintaining inclusive learning organizations. Dr. Annabi investigates diversity and inclusion initiatives aimed at recruiting, retaining, and advancing women of color, and neurodivergent employees. She pursues lines of inquiry focused on improving inclusive product management. Her work is published in academic and industry outlets to advance the science and practice of inclusion. Dr. Annabi collaborates with industry leaders to establish best practices for inclusion and recently authored the Autism at Work Playbook in partnership with Microsoft, SAP, JP Morgan Chase, and Ernst & Young. The Autism at Work Playbook is considered the industry guidebook for design, development, and scaling of autism hiring programs. I'm so excited about this topic today. I'm eager to get started. When we first announced that we would be doing a session on embracing neurodiversity in the workplace, I received a lot of feedback personally, a lot of people sort of excited about the topic. We reached over 500 individuals registered for this particular topic because I believe that it's not talked about enough in the workplace. In our conversations with Dr. Annabi, I'm just sharing some of my personal experiences with neurodiversity, and I'm sure, like many of you, have friends, families, colleagues who often have to deal with these challenges. And I'm sure, and in that conversation, it was expressed that many of the pushers of this movement are parents. Most of the individuals that I know who are parents of neurodivergent individuals have expressed a concern of when their child is work ready or ready to move into the workforce. Is this a conversation that's being had? Are our workforces, our teams prepared to deal with this? And I'm so thankful to have Dr. Hala with us today. So I'll hand it over to you. I'm eager to get started and ready to learn.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this introduction and for the enthusiasm you expressed about this topic that is very important and dear to me and many of my colleagues and friends. Before I start, just further introduce myself. My pronouns are he, she, her. I am a Middle Eastern woman with long brown hair, brown eyes. I'm wearing a burgundy shirt. And I'm very happy to speak with you today about this topic. And for those of you on the call, as Lamar mentioned, I am an academic, but I'm also a practitioner. My passion lies in understanding how organizations can best harness the talents and passions of all humans in all of its different forms. I try to understand what are the right practices and environment and structure that creates an environment where institutionally minoritized groups can thrive and show up in work and be who they are and contribute in ways that really enhance our world and our organizations. So that's been what my work for the last 20 some years. And I do it in many different forms. Before I also start talking about the topic, I want to be very clear that I am a neurotypical and I don't wish to speak or claim to speak on behalf of neurodivergent people. My role here is to share what I have learned through my research and my work with neurodivergent advocates, as well as organizations that work to champion neuro-inclusion in the workplace. A note on language that I also want to be clear about, I use identity first language versus person first language, because identity first language is the preferred language of the advocate community. And what I mean by identity first, I say neurodivergent person instead of a person with autism or a person with ADHD. And again, that is to honor the community and their focus and their preference. Today we're going to cover a number of things, and Lamar is going to help me maintain as much interaction and engagement from the group. He's been really engaging to me, and have already asked me a whole bunch of questions that change the way I think about presenting this content. But we're going to try to focus on 4 specific learning objectives, and I think you've all seen them in the call for this webinar. First, it's helpful for us to create a common understanding and a clear understanding of what we mean by neurodiversity, both from a concept perspective, but also from a movement perspective, and the various neurotypes. We also want to spend some time talking in meaningful ways and explicit ways about why it's so important to have a neurodiverse workplace and to have neuro-inclusion in the workplace. And then we're going to get into the know-how of how do we understand and create neuro-inclusive workplaces, and some of the specific communication and collaboration preferences that we might want to highlight in our practice. So those are our goals overall for our 90 minutes together, and they're going to go pretty fast, especially that Lamar and I are really excited about many of these topics. We're not going to get deep into any one area, but it's going to be an introductory webinar, if you will. Okay, and to start, let's begin with sharing our understanding of neurodiversity. Before we begin, we're going to launch a quick gauge of your level of understanding of neurodiversity. So if you could all answer your response to, I know what neurodiversity means. Tell us about your confidence level with understanding neurodiversity.
We should now be seeing the results of our polls. So we will see that strongly agree received 12%, agree 41%, neutral 21%, disagree 22%, and strongly disagree 4%.
So hopefully, and this is just really a gauge, what we want to do is develop this understanding together, and we're going to do a checkpoint later on to see if we have improved some of people's understanding and how that's changed over time. And to begin to understand the concept of neurodiversity, I am going to use the words and a video from a neurodivergent advocate who has a beautiful way of really explaining what neurodiversity means as a concept, but also as a movement. So I'm going to share a quick video with all of you.
Hello, brains. I talk about neurodiversity a lot on this channel, in panels, at talks, but what exactly does neurodiversity mean? Neurodiversity, noun, is the concept that there is natural variation in the human brain that leads to differences in how we think and behave. It's short for neurological diversity. Neurodiversity. The term was first coined in the 1990s by a sociologist named Judy Singer, who argues that neurological differences, like autism, are just that, neurological differences. In other words, different brains work differently. Neurodiversity exists, just like diversity exists in ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. Those of us with ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette's, those who are neurotypical, and those who are autistic all have brains that are hardwired to work and learn differently. And even brains within each group are wired differently and have a spectrum of abilities. And while we can sometimes learn to mask those differences are still going to exist. And trying to pretend they don't, or being told that they shouldn't, often comes at a high cost to our sense of self and our mental and physical well-being, often putting our brain's operating system at higher risk for the mental health equivalent of malware, such as anxiety or depression, which is why the neurodiversity movement exists. The neurodiversity movement is a social movement historically led by autistic self-advocates and other neurodivergent activists, advocating for the acceptance of the autism spectrum as reflecting natural variations in the human brain rather than a disease that needs to be cured. This movement has grown within the autism community as well as to other neurodivergent folks. Hi. I have ADHD. While neurodiversity advocates might disagree on some things, and I obviously can't speak for everyone, there are a few key assumptions within the neurodiversity paradigm. 1. Neurodiversity exists. Different brains work differently and have distinct strengths and weaknesses. 2. Neurodiversity is valuable. Differences in how our brains work allow us to come at things from different perspectives, have vastly different skill sets, and accomplish more than we could if everyone's brain worked the same way. 3, the potentially disabling challenges that those of us who are neurodivergent face aren't necessarily inherent to our brain's differences, but often a result of the social and physical environments neurominorities exist within, which is highlighted perfectly in a blog post about the concerning condition called neurotypicality, written from an autistic perspective. The blog, which is satire, presents a world in which neurotypical brains are the neurominorities and discusses how odd those brains would seem and the challenges they would face in an autistic world. A personal example, I am very nearsighted. If I didn't live in a society that provided glasses and contacts, I would be disabled. The neurodiversity movement is a bit controversial in that it upends some of how we've thought about these things for a really long time. But most of the criticisms of the neurodiversity movement seem to come from misunderstandings of what it actually is. A lot of critics of the neurodiversity movement argue that viewing autism as just a natural variation implies that autistic people don't need any support. But in response to this criticism, one autism researcher and advocate explains it well. Neurodiversity advocates generally consider autism to be both a natural variation and a disability. Advocates therefore concurrently campaign for acceptance and respect for autistic people as valuable members of society, and also fight for appropriate support and services to meet the needs of the autistic community. And the same is true of most ADHD advocates. We recognize that life is hard for us, and there are times where it would be easier to not have ADHD. But a lot of what we struggle with is because of environmental and social factors, and can be mitigated through creating social and physical environments that account for and accommodate neurodiversity. That doesn't mean we reject medical treatment. As a neurodiversity advocate with ADHD, I'm working toward a world that recognizes, appreciates, and accommodates neurodiversity. I also have a therapist and take meds. Acceptance of my brain's differences and support for the challenges I face are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they both work toward the same goal, a better quality of life.
Okay. A few things I will highlight from the video that Jessica shared, and just also want to make sure that the voice is clear and we're all set up with the slides. Everyone can see the slideshow. Perfect.
Yep.
So the first thing I just want to emphasize is that neurodiversity refers to the virtually infinite neurocognitive variability that are important for the human population. It points out to the fact that each human is unique and different, and that we are a society that has been designed in a way that often creates barriers for those who have not been within the average community that also is the dominant community of how our world was designed, whether it's our social expectations or how our educational systems or our work environments have been created. So neurodiversity is also a movement. It's a social movement that emphasizes that challenges experienced by neurodivergent folks is due to how we as a majority have created barriers that creates environments that does not necessarily allow neurodivergent people to thrive in ways that are conducive to them and pushes them to assimilate. The other really important concept I want to refer to is neurodiversity encompasses neurotypical and neurodivergent neurotypes. So it encompasses everybody. And the other thing I want to point out is that 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent. And I want to talk a little bit about that data because that data is limited since we actually, especially with adults, we have low diagnosis of neurominorities, particularly across gender. We know that women are underdiagnosed, adults are underdiagnosed. And we also know that people of color have been underdiagnosed. So as we continue to learn, we see those numbers changing. Recent data showed that 1 in 5 people in society, and this research came out of England, are neurodivergent. So just so you know, that's the representation of this group. The other thing I want to emphasize that Jessica emphasized and highlighted in this group is advocates are generally considering autism or their neurominority as a natural variation and not a disability. However, there's a recognition and a need to understand that for those individuals to thrive, because of how our society has been structured, supports are needed, whether it's flexible work environment or a quiet and different type of lighting environment are essential to helping an individual thrive and contribute in ways that are conducive to them. When we think of neurominorities, we are referring to autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's system, dyscalculia, as well as other variations. And there are many different views around also mental health being a piece of or a variation of neurominorities. The other thing I want to also highlight is many of these neurominority conditions co-occur. So we, for example, know that autism and ADHD co-occur in about 35% of the autistic community. So this creates, hopefully shows that there's a lot of diversity within the community as well.
Dr.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, just a quick question. Sorry, just to chime in. And again, to the community, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You mentioned a couple things, and I'm sorry, right? A couple things stood out to me. One was the virtually infinite neurocognitive variables, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there's a significant amount of underdiagnosis in certain communities.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think of this as a movement, right, and I like the fact that you are using that this is also a movement. When I think about other variations, I'm thinking about how many more are there possibly, and how many more do we expect to see? You know, is it infinite? You know, I'm sure this is just a short collection of sort of the ones that we're aware of, but do we see this growing beyond what we can even measure at the moment?
So this is a really important question, Lamar, and this is where, when we think about neurominorities, these have also been pathologized, right? These are diagnostic within the medical framework because the way our medical establishment in our neurotypical society, or a society that has very strong normative expectations of what we expect people to behave and perform at, we've designed, and I'm getting a little maybe academic here, we've designed a society based on a functionalist perspective, where we design for an average or a mean and for dominant personalities and dominant groups in our structures. And things that are different, we often try to change to be more like the norm that we expect. And with the neurodiversity movement, and if you go back to the writings of Judy Singer, is even within the neurotypical range, everybody has differences and everybody has different needs and skills. So the idea and the hope is that we recognize all of these differences in different forms and design a world that helps people with many different ways of being, interact with the world, see the world in the way that they need to engage with it, versus try to create conditions and group people in certain ways. That's kind of the movement. It's a recognition that people will have different talents and different needs, and we need a society that recognizes and focuses on the strengths of these differences and leverages them and creates an environment where they can all engage in ways that are conducive to them and contribute in ways that are conducive to them, rather than a normative expectation of what people should bring and what people should contribute and engage. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And you know, if you know, we can think of these differences as infinite from the context of the movement and definition, in the hope that we, you know, design a society where everyone can get the supports and the structures that they need, right? So I hope that answers your question, but we don't know the numbers, and it's also diagnosis is pretty complex for adults. Diagnosis is getting better to provide the supports, so that's a pretty complex area that a lot of people are looking into and studying. And the recent report on autism in particular, we're starting to see improvement of the underdiagnosed females as well as people of color. We're starting to see better recognition and better awareness and better training for those professionals who do diagnose these neurominorities. I hope that answers the question.
No, for sure. Thank you.
Sure. A couple of other things on neurodiversity variations and how they appear and how we want to think about them. So while we often, and as I explained in, this slide, you know, we talk about autism or ADHD, even for neurominorities, or neurotypicals, one of the things to think about is we have very different ways in the way that our body and mind works that help us interact and see the world in particular ways that might align with normative expectations or be different. Our social understanding of how we might observe a phenomena or an engagement with someone, what we pay attention to and how we react to it will vary based on how our neurology is, but also how we were trained and developed and socialized over time. Same way with how our language develops. Some of it is different for different people and their different neurology. Our sensitivity to our environment. For example, some of us will seek light, will seek sound, we're sensory seeking. Some of us will avoid it. But that avoidance or that seeking varies in degrees. And for example, a hypersensitive autistic person to sound, any small sound, whether it's a ticking of a fan or a blast, will affect them differently because they hear it differently than a neurotypical person who is sensory seeking, or even an autistic person who's sensory seeking, where sound actually engages them in healthy ways. Same way in the way that we process information, what information we can pay attention to in terms of detail or high-level picture, how we attach that to our cognition changes. The way our memory works can also be different. And so those variations is what we are referring to and what creates these different neurominorities. So every person, neurotypical and neurodivergent, will measure differently and will have different ways in the way they react to emotion and express emotion. And one thing I want to highlight is this is a really important dimension of understanding neurodiversity. And there's always a misconception between, very neurodivergent or not neurodivergent, and you could replace different neurominorities there. So we often say they're very autistic or they're a little autistic, which is inaccurate because autism comes in different forms. An autistic person is an autistic person who might have different ways in their social processing or their information processing. So it's not a spectrum that is sequential, that is on a horizontal or a scale. It's really a form of these variations in the way that their body and mind might measure. So this is a better articulation or visual representation of whether they would measure high on emotional regulation or low on social understanding in the way that we have explained our normative expectations for all of the different ways that our body and mind works. So this really is to demonstrate that, and the reason why the neurodivergent community used the infinity sign is to illustrate that infinite variation that exists within neurodiversity or neurodivergence and neurominorities. And to highlight that if you've met one neurodivergent person, and really you could also replace neurodivergent with autistic or ADHD or a person with dyslexia, you've only met one, and the person has multiple identities and multiple needs. And it's really important to understand these variations. And the key point here is, and the key challenge is, when people vary from what society has reinforced as what's acceptable and what's good, we often judge any variations in behaviors and needs that we don't understand and have not been reinforced.
So we did actually get one question. Someone would love for you to talk about the differences in the medical model versus the social model of disability, if there's time.
Absolutely. So, and this is actually what we are getting into here when we talk about these different variations. The medical model pathologizes these differences, and the medical model tries to change a person's differences to assimilate to our neurotypical societal norms. The social model says our infinite variations are natural and they are inherent in the way of our being, and society has to change to provide different ways for us to interact with the world. The problem is, the social model states that the problem is not in the person, which is what often the medical model and the focus on treatment is. the social model is, let's change our society and our support systems and what we expect of our society, so that people can be who they are in ways that are conducive to their mental health and physical health and well-being, and allow different people ways to contribute in the ways that are natural to them, versus try to push them to assimilate to our society. And that's really when we say the key challenge is we often judge variations that we don't understand. They come at a high cost because they limit people from engaging in all kinds of things. And I'm going to get a little bit deeper into the medical versus social model in a second. One outcome of us pushing people to behave in ways that are not conducive to them and to assimilate is that we judge people who don't present in neurotypical ways, often in our employment practices. One of the things that we know and we have data on is neurodivergent adults have lower employment outcomes despite their intellectual abilities. We have individuals who have high IQs, have multiple even degrees, but are not able to secure employment because of potentially their social interactions, or because of some of the environmental supports that they might need in the workplace. Like, for example, working in an open environment, if you are an ADHDer that has constant interruptions, does not allow you to do the deep work that you need, because you need quiet to focus, for example. And we see some of this data in the autism community. There's an 80% underemployment and unemployment, compared to only 5% unemployment in the neurotypical world. And you see for ADHD, 1 in 3 are unemployed at any one time. And the research suggests it's not because they're not able to work or don't want to work. It's a lot of the social barriers and the expectations of how we design our work that prohibits them from either securing a job or maintaining a job. And that's because we have very strong expectations of what people can and should do. And so what happens is we are forcing neurotypical world and our practices in recruitment, how we write a job. Or for example, many interviews are emphasizing social characteristics versus job specific characteristics. So this is where the key challenge is the world, the neurotypical world, pushes neurodivergent people to assimilate, which is very problematic and comes at a very high cost. And that high cost is often what we refer to as masking. Many neurodivergent people expend so much energy that is not healthy and not natural to them to mask so that they can fit into the expectation of, for example, I need to maintain eye contact, or I need to learn how to do small talk, or, oh, I need to understand how these sports that I have no interest in might relate to the people I'm meeting with, although they don't make any sense to me from a logical perspective, because I'm a very logical person. So this is an illogical thing that I have to do, so I'm going to refuse it. And research shows that masking is exhausting physically and mentally. It introduces anxiety. It creates meltdown and shutdown and burnout, which have a lot of negative impacts on the well-being of neurodivergent people that are trying to assimilate, because we are prescribed into a medical model that says if you're different than a norm, you are less than and you don't have as many strengths, instead of the social model and the neurodiversity model, again, which emphasizes that neurodiversity and neurodivergent people have a lot of talents, and the challenges they experience is not inherent in them, it's inherent in the world that we've designed that does not allow them to contribute in ways that are conducive to them. Yes,
Dr. Hala, could we back up for just a second?
Yeah.
Because I think when it comes to the masking, I think, this stands out to me, right? Often in other areas, there's a masking that can take place in the work environment. But when it comes to this, and when I read how it can impact individuals becoming exhausted, anxiety, meltdown, shutdowns, burnout, often we could see these things as a result, and they could result in performance not only negatively impacting their health and well-being, but their performance as well. Trying to continue to wear this mask and become burned out, which then could lead to obviously performance issue, disciplinary action. I don't know if most people are even equipped, or even HR areas are even equipped to know if there's just a burnout happening because of other reasons and not necessarily because of the job and the work environment.
Absolutely. So one of the things to consider is when you are a neurodivergent person that does not necessarily have the interest or preference to do small talk and to have these social interactions, because you have a different way of understanding the world and are very logical. And you have to think a little bit harder about how to infuse these small talks and mimic and really model what you see around you. You're expending so much cognitive energy on these non-value added aspects. I'll give you an example. In one of my interviews with a product manager or program manager at a technology company, she was a female Asian immigrant who was autistic. And I want to add those layers because you could see all the layers of culture, right? Especially when you think about neurodivergent culture. So, and she was technically incredibly savvy, and that's why she was promoted. And she was explaining to me that she understands, and the expectation for her as a manager of a product group is to create this social atmosphere and these interpersonal reactions. And so the night before, she would write in her calendar the kinds of things she needs to say and ask her team, the social pieces, before she even starts her day. And they don't come naturally to her. That's not, and also, I mean, there's also a double whammy of she comes from a different culture, different country, different expectations, there's different focus, but also for her neurodivergence. And she said, I spend so much energy and spend an hour every day to try to focus on this. Why can't I just focus on my work and their work? Why do I have to add these elements? And these elements are not natural to me. So you have to understand how much that takes away from her productivity of 1 hour each day, but also the fact that she has to do some studying and think about what she needs to do. That's a very explicit example of how that shows up in the way that different people might need to interact and react.
Another question just came in, and some would love to hear your thoughts on how, or if you see a correlation or comorbidity of neurodivergence with other DEI minorities, for example, from the LGBTQ plus community. Do you think it could help us include thinking for combinations of approaches for total inclusivity?
Absolutely. So one of the things we are seeing more and more is the fact that neurodivergent people come with many different identities, including the LGBTQ community. And I've seen a couple of panels that speak specifically around gender, and especially that gender represents a lot of normative expectations. And so you see that layer, and there isn't conclusive research. There's new research that talks about particularly the intersectionality between gender identity and neurodivergence. And I can't speak to the details of it because it's earlier research, but that's an area that's being explored. Because again, whenever we're speaking about representing identities that are of the neurotypical priorities and normative ways of being, we are creating more and more barriers, and they come at the intersection of race, gender, ethnicity, cultural background, national background. So the complexity of neurodiversity comes in all of these different intersections of identity. And the bottom line of this movement is, our goal in neurodiversity movement is to break down barriers that keep neurodivergent individuals from thriving in ways that are healthy and conducive to them. But really importantly, and this is the next point we'll make, is that's the strength and the value that is also important for the workplace and for society. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And one of the things, as someone who studied gender and race and ethnicity for years before I studied neurodiversity, what we do for neurodiversity impacts and affects and is helpful for everybody, neurotypical and neurodivergent. It also helps decodify some of the things that we don't always associate necessarily with gender barriers, but they're important for that as well. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm going to take a pause here and see if people have other questions about what neurodiversity is, and also launch our next poll about whether we've improved your understanding of neurodiversity. So we're going to launch a poll that asks you, my understanding of neurodiversity was spot on, yes, no. If you can answer that, and if you have questions about what neurodiversity is, please take a moment to write it in the chat.
All right, so we currently have 14% strongly agree, 41% agree, 22% neutral, 20% disagree, and 3% strongly disagree.
Okay, so hopefully this means that you've changed your understanding, or you've learned some gaps or new things, or hopefully new even questions about neurodiversity, and hope that you can engage with us and ask us some of these questions. Before we move ahead, any questions came up that we should answer for you?
Yes, actually, another question came in. What is the best way to have the type of neurodivergence diagnosed or assessed?
So I think there's different ways to think about this. From my perspective on a work practices and neuroinclusion perspective, the diagnosis is not the focus. Our focus is how do we create neuroinclusive environments where diagnosis, whether we have a diagnosis or not, is not the goal. The goal is figuring out what are the practices that are inhibiting people, whether they know they're not neurodivergent or not, whether they're diagnosed or not. Because also remember, some accommodations, you have to have diagnosis. Diagnosis is expensive. Often it's not available in many areas within the state. So the goal of neurodiversity and their neurodiversity employment movement is creating the workspaces that are enabling people to show up and be who they are in ways that are conducive. And this is about creating common understanding and practices, just to be clear, that are productive for the work environment. I hope that answers the question.
No, thank you for making that distinction. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in knowing how can I create a more inclusive environment, a greater sense of belonging in the areas that I have control over, as well as becoming a little bit more aware of where I'm excluding individuals. And I think that's what we're about to get into a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to begin with another question. And this is a thought question. And you can type it into the chat if you'd like as well. We're going to move into really understanding and appreciating why neurodiversity is important for the workplace. And this is, we talk about this is the right thing to do, and equity and inclusion is a societal expectation. But I also want to talk about it, why it's an organizational and business imperative as well. Because this is not just a nice to have and we want to be good and we want to do this. This is essential for the way we work so we can maintain productivity and innovation and representation of the people we are serving as well. So before we get into this particular topic, this is a thought piece and we're going to give you 10 seconds to think about it and maybe write something down. Neurodiversity enriches, so fill in the blanks. Neurodiversity enriches the workplace in the following ways. In your experience and your understanding, how does neurodiversity, having variations across neurominorities and neurotypical people in your workplace, enriches your workplace? Can you think of a few areas? Okay. So one of the things that we know and research has shown us is that neurodiversity movement emphasizes the strengths that neurodivergent people bring in. And this is actually a movement that's happening in society broadly. Neurodiversity movement is one way of it. A lot in the disability movement talk about the strengths that disabled people also bring. One scholar talks about it in terms of cool ability. But for example, a person who is sensitive to noise can actually be pretty good at identifying sound and music variations, for example. A person who focuses on detail can be a really good analyst to figure out patterns and identify differences in patterns. One of the things we know about some in our ADHD community, because of their interest and their ability to multitask, they can be really creative. They can see different things and patterns from different ways of thinking and bring them together. So often you hear ADHD is often associated with creativity, right? Those on the spectrum can be very logical and focus on fact, but this also adds to their honesty and to the fact that they do not allow for groupthink in their teams. So those are different ways that we've seen, and this image in particular is from one of my colleagues, Nancy Doyle, who's a neurodivergent advocate, who speaks and identifies all the research that identified these different strengths. And the idea is, and this is not new to many of us who are champions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, people who have different experiences and different ways of thinking and being can bring different light to solving problems. And that's a critical part for the workplace. So when we think about the unique strengths, whether it's attention to detail, analytical thinking, visualization, multitasking, that all produce different ways for us to solve problems and to serve the communities we're trying to serve. It also helps us introduce different ways of interactions when we see those differences so that we can achieve the desired outcomes. I'll give you an example. I worked for a dean who was highly analytical. And so my first couple of months was trying to really figure out, why is he asking me the questions he's asking? But then with time, I figured out his communication patterns and his focus were on specific analytical ways and data that shows what I'm trying to achieve. And when I was able to get what he's looking for, my reports became much more succinct, much more factual, but they really got me to the outcomes I desired. But it's really understanding his preferences and the ways that he was thinking, right? And he was a neurotypical person, but I think it's an important example to share. Many of the ways I'm talking about is just for us to understand the preferences and the ways that the people we're working with think and can understand their world, and also some of their priorities, so that we can engage in productive ways, rather than me insisting, because I'm very social and I focus on the social characteristics, to get on the, I would say, the social soft sides versus the analytical first, and where do I begin? And those are really important. And we also know, and we've seen from the research, that there are many characteristics of neurodivergent minorities that show up in the workplace that are of great benefit. We know, for example, an ADHD or an autistic person who has a deep interest in a particular area, they're continuous learners and they become deep experts in that area. And they can be really innovative. And imagine if you have a person who has the natural ability and tenacity to pursue deeper ways of thinking and knowledge about your expertise area. And so that's of high benefit for innovation. And I'll pause here to see if there are questions or reactions, Lamar.
Some questions, yeah. So first question that comes to mind, excuse me, it's moving as I'm trying to ask the question. How to incorporate people with these types of neurodivergence into a toxic work culture and expectations of microaggressive leadership? What does this look like for leadership who embrace diversity?
Yeah. So this is a pretty loaded question. It has multiple layers. And in our next piece, I'm going to break it down into different ways. First, we're going to talk about how to create a neuro-inclusive culture in your leadership. And then we're going to talk about very explicit practices around communication differences, work differences, and environmental differences that can give you, hopefully, some key components. But I do want to address one piece of the culture piece and the leadership piece. Neuro-inclusion is a culture. It's a culture of valuing people with differences and bringing a strength perspective rather than a deficit view of differences from normative expectations. And that takes time, and that takes some real intention in the workspace. And we're going to talk about that in more detail, so I don't want to go there yet.
Just one other question, and I think honestly we're leading up to this,
Yeah.
but how can we create a more inclusive environment if staff do not disclose their specific neurodivergent needs?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming there's basic accommodations that any of us can provide, and maybe you can share some of that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we're going to talk about is there are accommodations, right? Reasonable accommodations around whether it's work flexibility or other dimensions that might be needed. But we have actually, and most accommodations that are requested are what we think of as success enablers. These are dimensions and designs of work and context of work that it's provided for all, and we're seeing, especially with the mass resignation and the high levels of burnout, organizations are moving more and more towards flexibility and customizability of work for employees. So much of what you're going to hear us talk about, it's identifying what are the needs of the person and how much of that is just reasonable success enablers with minor variations to work and types of interactions that don't require deep accommodations, right? Some deep ADA accommodations, I understand that in some work environments we need to do that, but I want to highlight it's really important to understand that diagnosis and disclosure are a very personal decision, and it's a fraught decision because people have experienced significant trauma, significant discrimination over their lifespan, where disclosure is not an option due to their experience. And as your work becomes more and more neuro-inclusive, people are more likely to disclose because they find that trust. So it's such a tough balance, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more.
I would agree with that. I think you know, individuals' willingness to disclose is a product of the environment. But I think some of those basic accommodations, and again, I don't want to jump too far ahead. I think we do them every day. We may not realize them, right? As you welcome someone into your office, typically as you're training them, you're asking them, you know, what's your learning style, right? Would you rather me lecture to you, or would you rather see a PowerPoint slide? What's your best way of communicating, right?
Yeah.
Are you an email person, or do you want me to pick up the phone? Some of these things are there, but if we're not asking the right questions, often these people don't feel like they have a real opportunity to be successful in our environments.
Absolutely. They're about alignment and setting expectations, a significant number of them. And really, you know, it gets to the point of our opportunity is to gain, you know, to gain the benefits of this neurodiversity is to cultivate neuro-inclusive culture and to understand that some of our expectations are not conducive to inclusion, and they're also not conducive to the best ways to do the work to be productive. They've just become ingrained into our thinking and our psyche as the right way and the value way, but they're not necessarily. And sometimes when we start questioning them and changing them, we're like, oh my gosh, now that makes sense. Why didn't we do this before? So I think some of the questions for you to think about is, you know, take a moment to reflect on what's your organization's readiness to include neurodivergent people. How do you foster neuro-inclusion that celebrates the strengths and provides supports? And recognizing that the majority of supports are success enablers and not accommodations that require diagnosis or a formal process. And it's really understanding that this is about creating, co-creating common ground that's an inclusive environment. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, and I'm being mindful of the time because we do have a lot of things that we want to cover, but I'll start by talking about neuro-inclusive workplace. And I'm going to talk about it in a couple of forms, but just generally understanding that creating neuro-inclusive workplace is trying to understand that variations in the different dimensions of how we process the world socially, how our emotions show up, our attention to our time, the way we process information is what creates these differences. Understanding them as preferences and differences to minimize the negative impact and the pressures to assimilate will help us get the strengths and celebrate them. critical to that is really understanding where our practices, whether it's in recruitment, interview, onboarding, retention, whether it's in performance or empowerment, and any processes around advancement, understanding where some of our practices are excluding neurodivergent variations and preferences becomes really important. For example, if we often fall into these double binds, if you will, where we have flexible work arrangements, but we somehow embed how engaged are they in the social events of our organization. If they don't attend certain events that are not required, we just think of them as less committed, although they might require flexibility because commuting is so much, so giving a person to work from home 1 day a week is helpful to them. Or let's say for a parent leaving early at 3, even if they come in at 7, we start getting certain conceptions about when we're evaluating their commitment, we start looking at the very flexibilities we've given them and counting it against them, right? So where in our work structures do we create some barriers around even accommodations and work flexibility that we provide becomes really important. So when you're looking at your processes, and I think of them as the lifespan of your employee, where are the normative expectations? And where can we create real appreciation for variations in communication, social interaction? We often hear, they're not a fit for my team. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
If they can do the job and you could work on different ways where you can be effective, is the fact that, for example, they're not as interested in maybe being a parent, or if they're not interested in overly social interactions, is that going to prohibit them? And how can you keep that away from your processes? And highlighting where that might seep in is important. And before I let Lamar ask me a question, for those who really want to dive deep into it, we actually have, there's a couple of resources that dig deep into how do you decode and make your interview process, your interview format, and some of your performance evaluation metrics void of these normative expectations. Go ahead.
Just for the sake of time, because I know that we're pressed against the clock a little,
Yes.
but I see where there's a lot of challenges here, and
Yes.
literally in each step, but focusing specifically on the interview and some of those normative expectations that we have, we were kind of groomed or assimilated, if you will, into the eye contact, the firm handshake, you know, how articulate is this person, you know, don't use the space fillers, are they picking up on social cues? And that could prevent an individual from being provided an opportunity. How much of an overhaul of our traditional interview process really needs to take place?
I would say quite a bit. So one of the things we do when we start looking at recruitment is we actually look at the interview practices and we strike out all of the social elements of the evaluation criteria, but also the questions you ask. So a few quick techniques, for example, in recruitment. One is we look at the job description and we make sure that we are explicit about what's expected of the job and what needs to be demonstrated in technical expertise. And so what's really needed versus what is desired. And we really push our teams to make a critical distinction, but also to lay that out very explicitly, because for example, one of the things we know with with autistic students that look at a job description, if they find one thing that they can't do, they will not apply for a job because they think of it as a checklist that has to be met. So being very clear about, are you expecting all of these things or some of these things? And separating the must-have from the elements. And the other thing is cover letters are not helpful because they're not explicit enough. So having very explicit prompts that are job relevant for a person to demonstrate. Another thing is, like, if you're recruiting for technical positions, demonstration of work beforehand in ways that are conducive is far better than these elaborate questions that are really hard to do during the interview. The other very quick thing is sharing an interview question, a set of interview questions before the interview reduces anxiety and helps people who need, like introverts who need to process a question before they respond to it, really be ready for that interview. And some will say, well, I need someone who can think quick on their feet. Well, a lot of jobs, you don't need someone that's quick on their feet because it's about deep work. So thinking about that is really important. And there are, we can get into recruitment and interview for 2 hours alone, and we won't get into that, but those are really important things to think about.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. And you can think of onboarding in the same way. And from the employers I work with that have really tried to create neuro-inclusive pathways, we have designed, and I'll share actually a resource, the Autism at Work Playbook, that talks specifically about how to break down the recruitment, how to break down the interview, and there's another resource that I will share with you. And this gets to the question here, will I know who's neurodivergent? Shouldn't they tell me? Should they be diagnosed? Again, some may know. Most adults don't know that they're neurodivergent because many have not been diagnosed, and that's not been part of the question. Disclosure is very personal, as we talked about, so I don't want to get into it more. Also, it's really important not to ask or try to assume. Really focus on how can we create a common ground that creates an effective practice for everybody. That's really the focus for all of us, so that we're more effective in collaboration and management practices. And again, I can't begin to tell you, from all the organizations I work for, all the practices we suggest become helpful for everybody, and we call it the spillover effect. Managers who go through neuro-inclusive team management and practice neuro-inclusive practices become better managers for neurotypical and neurodivergent people alike, and underserved minoritized communities speak specifically to how their manager even became better for them, because all of a sudden the manager is aware of biases that are enforced on so many different people, right? So some of the things to think about for yourself is like, where do I start? There's so much to learn. I think the first thing to start is by, as we go through this, think about self-awareness, thinking about the areas where you might have certain preferences that could be exclusive of neurodivergent people, whether it's social interaction. For example, I have a really good friend of mine who is an ADHDer and hypersocial, and when she gets to talking, she doesn't stop in the workplace, and how that's limited her career in some ways. So think about, what does that mean, and how can I engage in conducive ways with a person who is very capable, but their social behaviors sometimes affect how we view their seriousness about work. So focusing on the strengths, that this person is actually multitasking and has a lot of creativity. So how do I create some boundaries around how much we can talk at any one point, and how we can manage interruptions so we can get the work, and recognizing their needs by asking them for how is it best to work with them and what makes them most successful, and really taking their lead also, not suggesting things that they don't necessarily need. That's kind of like a one place to start. Lamar, do you have a question, or should I keep going?
No, please keep going. For the sake of time, we probably should speed up just a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of other things. You all have particular positions in your organization. Some of you are advanced in your career. Some of you might be earlier in your career. What you can do to push neuro-inclusion depends on your position of power and privilege. But remember that you can do some of this individually in your interactions and your interpersonal interactions in supporting your team members, but also for some of you who are advanced, you can really push the envelope on policy change as well. And we're going to start with kind of the high level leadership piece, if you will. When we talk about neuro-inclusion, it's really important to understand that neuro-inclusion is a cultural element that is an organizational context. And it's important to clearly articulate why neuroinclusion matters in your organization, in the way it relates to your mission and values, in the way it relates to how you value all employees, and in the way that you serve your customers and your community. And understand that your leaders need to support these initiatives and be public about it. One way they're public about it is to talk about it under the umbrella of DEI. Another way to talk about it, and we've seen really successful, is if you have a neurodivergent leader, to explain that they are neurodivergent and that this is an important piece is also critical. And leverage the current strengths of your organization, whether it's the culture of inclusion, whether it's the culture of creativity and innovation, whatever dimensions, and many of us are in universities, innovation is at the heart of it, and serving learning differences is at the heart of what we do. So, for any university and research center, neurodiversity is at the heart of what we do, because it's about different ways of thinking and being, creating solutions. And critical to that is understanding that you need to build capacity of your staff and your people to understand how to change the work practices, to identify the barriers and to break them. And a critical part of that is to partner with your neurodivergent employees. And I can't emphasize that enough. And identify these areas where you fall apart is a critical part of creating that culture. So I'm going to pause here and see if you have any questions about, this is what I think of as the leadership framework for transforming your organization into a neuro-inclusive culture, before I get into the dyad level.
Nope. Let's move along, and then the questions that we do have, we'll save for Q&A.
Awesome. A critical part of that is also thinking about how this manifests at the team level. And I'm just realizing that this slide might be a little small for some of you, but this is actually a resource that I've attached for you at the end of this presentation, so you can access the writing about it. I think it's really important to train your team on neuro-inclusive communication and collaboration practices. And that's a longer training that we do and others do. But it's really important to give your team members the tools, the know-how of communication and collaboration practices. And we're going to talk about a few of them in a minute. Assess your recruitment processes to identify barriers, redesign areas where there are barriers, and make sure that you emphasize a strength perspective that can be captured in the way that you assess and engage, but also that enriches a mode and culture of curiosity. Instead of judging a difference and thinking as different as less than, think of it as an opportunity to learn whether there's something differently that I can benefit from in this context. Accommodate individual needs so that they can perform their best. Remember that when we invest in our employees and we sometimes minor tweaks to their work schedule or to the way their work is designed. For example, if you have someone who is an incredible data analyst that can really get into your data but is not good at writing, maybe get the person who's really good at the writing and not good at the data analysis and team them together so that you could leverage both of their strengths rather than expect both of them to do everything. Normalize differences and flexible work arrangements by allowing it to everybody in your team, not just the person with, for example, an accommodation, but very importantly, as a leader, manager, or a leader, take those flexible work arrangements and talk about them, that you're leveraging it so you can normalize it and cultivate that culture of constructive feedback so that you can help people do their work better. But the constructive feedback has to be job specific and how it impacts the job. And design resources for neurodivergent employees to engage with you and let you know what they want. One of the things we know is a lot of neurodivergent employees have struggled so much to get work that they often are worried about asking for anything or for challenging a behavior that's problematic. So work on advocacy as well. I think that's really important. And most importantly, make everybody accountable for inclusion, right? I'm going to actually skip this question because I do recognize that we are running out of time and get into some of the specifics around work practices. We're going to do that for, I see that we have 21 minutes left. So we're going to do that for 10 minutes and then give 10 minutes of more questions.
That sounds perfect. Yep.
Awesome. So let's talk about practices and common ground. Oops, my mouse is very sensitive today. Okay, so creating common ground, as I mentioned earlier, there some neurominorities might communicate differently and have differences in communication. But when you think about it, many of us have different preferences of communication depending on our work. So one of the things, for example, I do with my team, whenever we have someone join, I meet with them and I have a document that was actually prepared. It was adapted from a research project that was done by La Trobe University, and I'll share that with you, that goes through different dimensions of work that create conflict and that create variations in the way that people show up to work. So I go through and ask my team around certain preferences. One of them is communication preferences. So one of the trainings I do is around communication preferences. And the first thing I always ask the participants in the training is to be explicit about what their communication preferences are. And most people will be like, I've never thought about that explicitly. I've never had a chance to articulate that. So this is an important thing. Do you prefer to meet face-to-face or online? I have a partner who hates any Zoom meeting. So all his meetings have to be face-to-face. So how do I work with that? Frequency. Do I wait till the end of the day to ask all my questions and interact? Or is it a once a week update? Or is it every other day? How frequent should my communication be with my team members, with my manager? Let's be explicit about that. Predictability. When should I be interrupted and when should I expect communication? One practice a colleague of mine used is for those who like to do deep work, and when they get interrupted, they can't get back into that flow, putting a sign on their door to say, deep work, please do not interrupt, is very effective. And that was a neurodivergent person that started using it in the team. And all of a sudden, all team members started using it. And it reduced tension. Think about how often you get interrupted when you're right in the middle of that sentence or paragraph, and someone interrupts you and you get flustered. You react to them negatively. They become reactive as well. And sometimes it creates tension that is not needed. Another thing to think about is the tempo and speed of communication. For example, I talk fast and I talk with my hands. Some of my students and my colleagues get a little overwhelmed. So trying to understand their pace is really important. For those of you who do a lot of agile team meetings where you're doing a lot of your reporting standing up and kind of rapid fire, that doesn't work for everyone in your team. So how can you use take a moment to think and write and then communicate could be really helpful. For some, and this is important for neurodivergent people who have a hard time reading metaphors, but it's also really important for immigrants. I've been in the US for many years, and there are certain cultural jokes and contexts that I just do not understand, right? Because I did not grow up in it. So really understanding that you need to use explicit language and humor and metaphors can be really hard is important. So what kinds of questions can you ask, but also observe so that you can adjust your communication patterns rather than expecting everyone else to adjust to yours? What's the middle ground, right, is really important. So this is one practice area that is critical. How do we communicate, in what form, how often is really important. Another one is work preferences. You know, are you really good at working in groups or are you better working alone? And what's the balance? Obviously, we all have to work together in groups, but there are many of us that have tasks that are better done alone. So how do you balance that? Some people say, give me just the highlight of what the goal of the product is and I can go ahead and do it. While others might need more explicit instructions of what do you want the outcome to be and perhaps how to get there. So depending on the preference of the person, finding that out you might spend a little bit more time initially to give the task and the scope of the work. But you find that it actually saves you time in the long run because you're not correcting and recorrecting and redoing the work. So the more explicit you are with those who need explicit directions and detailed work becomes really important. Also, understand the preferences of some of us can work on a task in isolation of what it needs to fit, as long as there's explicit directions. Others really need to understand the context of the work to be engaged with it. So asking that question and providing that context becomes important. Some people are very happy with repetitive work and not multiple tasks. Others get really bored very quickly. So understand that about your team and manage that is really important. And I say this because research, particularly on the autism community, talked so much about they like repetitive tasks, so this is great, because a lot of people don't like repetitive tasks. Well, not every autistic person needs repetitive tasks or like repetitive tasks. So clarifying those differences becomes really important. So, think about context. I'll give you an example from my work. I had an assistant who liked a very explicit description of what she needed to do and just enough information. I like to talk about the work in detail and provide context because I feel like that's partnership. That's how I like to work. Mm-hmm. And I realized that with time, I was overwhelming her. It was something that really stressed her out because she thought that she needed to do all of these things with me. So just understanding how to scope it becomes really important. I'm going to do like two quick ones. One is the tolerance for change. Understand that some people worry about change and get really anxious when, especially the team context changes, because it takes them so long to understand a task and to build relationships. Mm-hmm. So one of the resources I share later is how to manage change and uncertainty for some folks in detail. And then, actually I'm going to skip this because this is more, but this is just another example of the ways you can talk about the expectation of organizational clutter, workplace timeliness, adaptability and flexibility, tolerance for stress and pressure of the work. One of the most meaningful practices that we know around organizational skills is for some folks who have memory challenges or have a hard time focusing on the details when there's a lot of people in a meeting, having a clear minutes and takeaways with to-dos in writing after a meeting is a very effective practice that will help with that. Another critical part around focus and regulation is understanding how to scaffold deadlines and be clear. When you give somebody a task and say, do this when you get to it. For some person, because you're the boss, they might prioritize it. For others, like, oh, when I can get to it, this means when I can get to it. It's not explicit enough. So being really explicit about that becomes really important. And understanding how to help your team stay focused in ways that are conducive to them so they can get to the deep work is so essential. And it's becoming a real problem with our connectivity and our hybrid work environments where people feel like they always have to be responsive, which means they always have to be interrupted. So for example, my team, we have a signal on our teams about when we're being interrupted and when we're in deep thought so we can manage that work. The last, there's so much in here and we've kind of got into some questions, but this is another important one. Sensory preferences, right? Some of us like touch, some of us don't, so be mindful of that. One of the really hard things around big organizations, especially universities, are all these very old fluorescent lights. And so some say, well, I have to get accommodations and going to cost us a couple $1,000 to change all of this lighting, versus you could actually get a cellophane cover that is made specifically to cover fluorescent lights that reduce that brightness and makes it very helpful. For many of us, we might not recognize the flicker in the light. For another person, it gives them a headache and a migraine. So understanding that difference is really important. Sound is the same way. There are some organizations like Microsoft. The minute you get hired, you get head canceling noise headphones, because everybody knows it's effective for everybody and everyone needs it. So you don't have to have an accommodation to get that. That's just a success enabler. And it's a very inexpensive one when you buy in bulk. One I will say very quickly is also smell. Heating lunches. I always say, you know, heating lunches might be very simple and no one thinks about it until, for example, you might be pregnant and expecting and you have morning sickness. And so when someone is heating a really pungent lunch, that affects how they are, their ability to work, right? So maybe have the kitchens and the microwave and where you eat separate from where you do your work. Very simple, helps everybody in many different ways, right? But we often don't think about it. Interpersonal skills is a pretty complex place, but really understanding that some people are really good at recognizing facial expressions, some don't. Some over-empathize versus others under-empathize, and understand those reactions and how you really react to them. Some might be really talkative, while others are not. And again, these variations I'm talking about are across neurodiversity, neurotypical and neurodivergent. But for some neurodivergent, this might be really different and challenging. So understanding those variations by asking questions, by also being more explicit and not judging a person because they don't take your sense of humor or your sarcasm is really important. So try to reduce the sarcasm or the humor and be direct. Will help build those interpersonal relationships. These are all kind of intertwined. So understanding that becomes helpful. I'm going to stop here because I shared multiple things around creating common ground. I'm sure some of you are overwhelmed with the levels of it. We wanted to give you the whole gamut so you can get ideas. And we would spend a whole hour on each one of these at some point. Yes, Lamar.
No, but thank you. I said it earlier, a lot of information to digest, but I do love this concept that you use, this success enablers versus accommodations, right? 'Cause I think of, you know, myself as a hiring manager for the last 10 years, or just me being hired into a role.
Yeah.
How many times have I been asked these questions so to ensure and to enable my success, or was I just expected to assimilate to whatever the expectation or whatever the culture was? So I think in any of our desire to be good colleagues, good collaborators, good managers, asking a simple question, what's your preference? It goes a long way.
Yeah.
We do have some really good questions in
Yep.
from our attendees. The first one, I often ask in my performance management meetings with employees, how can I best support and understand you? I'm hoping for feedback in the particular ways that I can best interact with each person. I often get, you are doing fine, or I don't know.
Mhm.
How can I better ask the question of employees to understand how I can best support all employees in my role as a manager?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I think it's helpful to be explicit and break it down to them, right?
Yeah.
So when you say, are there better ways for us to communicate? Or I've noticed that you respond to my emails right away. You don't have to respond to my email right away. It's not urgent. Take your time. So breaking it down and really using a framework to ask about these different dimensions I explained is really helpful. And I will share, there's a particular assessment that I pull from quite a bit. It's published on the Neurodiversity Hub. It's called an assessment tool. You could actually go create a framework. That's the framework I create, where I break down these different expectations. How can I do better in ways we communicate? Do you need more communication? Do you need less communication? What about feedback? Are you getting the feedback that you need? Is there different ways for me to develop that feedback? Those are ways you could think about. Being very explicit about the dimensions is really important. Another way to think about it too is, this is not just the you and your employee or your direct report. This is also a team level. One exercise I do with my team, especially when we get new people coming in, is I do what it's called a team alignment. What are the best communication patterns across all of us? And we sometimes get a common understanding. We had a team member who basically would not communicate all day when we were virtual, and will communicate at the end of the day at night when we're all gone. And we were like, that's not working for all of us. We need a balance there, right? So I think a team alignment with a guided structure is really helpful.
Thank you. Another question then. How can a successful team be created when it is the supervisor that is neurodivergent, for example, the researcher?
Yep. So this is a great question, and we're starting to study more and more neurodivergent leaders. I think it's in the same way. One is for the neurodivergent leader to ask some of these questions, but also for their team members to communicate and say, can you tell me a little bit more about what's the best way to communicate with you so I'm effective at getting you what you need in the ways that you need it? And providing an explicit feedback to say, here are some of the things I really like about how we're communicating, and it would help me if we can communicate in this way. Because remember, this is about a two-way creating common ground, right? It's not about one person assimilating to the other. It's about finding the differences, but also recognizing that some things are just neurologically and physically harder for a person. Just because the whole team needs it to be loud doesn't mean that this other person can physically be there all the time because it'll overwhelm them. So it's about common ground, not one dominant way. So a couple of things. I've covered a lot of grounds, and I know that Lamar and Latasha are going to share with you the slide deck. Feel free to access it. One thing in particular, I highlighted some being mindful of microaggressions. So there are some things that I want you to read about. We won't have time to talk about them. Remember that we're all learning all the time and adjusting the ways that we are trying to honor people in ways that they feel honored and they can be productive. By focusing on their strengths and recognizing what their unique needs are. Just because my spouse, who's an introvert, who is very sensitive to noise, likes things in a particular way, does not mean another person would like it in the same way. So asking questions in respectful ways and taking their lead is really essential. I would say those are the foundations. There's so much that we've covered, and you know, there's a lifetime of resources. Few resources that I've developed myself with collaboration from 20-some companies that do this better than most, and are some of the best practices, is housed under Disability In, which is the Association for Empowering Disability Employment. The playbook helps you understand how to design autism hiring and neurodiversity hiring programs and practices. But in that resource, there's also a number of guides that we just released last week. They're called the Employee Engagement and Growth Series that gets into the specifics of some of the practices I talked about. There are two on neuroinclusive culture, both from a manager perspective and an organizational perspective. One particular resource that I love is creating psychological safety and what that means and how to do it in a neuroinclusive or a neurodiverse place. Organizational change and manager change, how do you do that? So there are a number of really good resources there that I highly suggest that you refer to, leverage. If you do have any questions, here's my email, feel free to email me. And again, we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, just one more question. How can we measure the impact and success of neurodiversity initiatives in the workplace, and what metrics should we consider?
Absolutely. So the metrics part is one of the hardest parts. And actually the document on neuroinclusive and creating neuroinclusive organizations has a section on metrics, but I'll give you a few things. One, representation matters. So knowing who and how many, whether you retain them or not, but also talking to your neurodivergent community, both in an ERG form and in surveys to figure out their engagement, identifying that they do identify as neurodivergent in their engagement, and seeing the differences and how that grows over time is critical. So representation matters, retention matters, engagement and sense of belonging are three very explicit ways. The other thing is advancement. It's not that you retain them, it's you advance them over time, is also another way. But again, the neuro-inclusive culture has a section on measurement that could be helpful for that question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Hala Annabi, for this remarkable program today. Thank you all who joined us for this conversation.